So thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and I'm really happy to be here to share my passion for systematic reviews in general and qualitative systematic reviews in particular. So let's begin this introduction into the what's, how's, and whys of qualitative systematic reviews. So in this webinar, I'll be talking about systematic reviews in general, and then qualitative systematic reviews in particular. We'll go through the general process of conducting a qualitative systematic review with some examples from published studies. And then we'll look at some specific types of qualitative systematic reviews and end with some deliberations, considerations, issues facing qualitative systematic reviews. And as Ricardo said, we'll do this in about 45 minutes, so that should leave us some good time for questions. So what is a systematic review? Before we jump into qualitative systematic reviews, I want to just talk quickly about systematic reviews more broadly. Systematic reviews are empirical research. So instead of collecting data by surveys or interviews or observations, the data collected for a systematic review are research studies. In systematic reviews, just like about any other research study, you go through a systematic, hence the word, process of posing a research question, sampling, data collection, analysis, and of course, write-up. I want to do some comparisons, but don't worry, I'm not going through this entire table. But this might be a good point to note that this presentation will be available for download from the IIQM site in a week or so. So this is in addition to the audio recording. We'll also post the PowerPoint slides and my notes. So systematic reviews in general are different from narrative or traditional and critical reviews of the literature. For example, the purpose of a systematic review is to answer a research question. The purpose of a literature review is to provide an overall summary or overview of a topic. And the purpose of a critical review is to critique literature on a topic, hence the name. Systematic reviews also, compared to literature reviews and critical reviews, tend to take longer. They involve more people. They follow a systematic process and standard guidelines for reporting. And if you look down at the very bottom of the page, it says systematic reviews usually follow PRISMA guidelines, and there will be a link to that in what you can download. And we'll talk a bit about PRISMA later. So first, the term systematic review is a broad one that refers to both the three quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method systematic reviews. Quantitative and meta-analysis is the term for the synthesis and analysis of quantitative research. Mixed method systematic reviews include quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method studies. And qualitative systematic reviews aggregate, integrate, and or interpret the findings from usually qualitative studies to answer a research question. I say usually because there are a couple of qualitative systematic review designs that also include quantitative and mixed methods studies in their reviews. So systematic reviews, including qualitative ones, are most often conducted in the fields of health and education. I'm going to assume a lot of you attending this webinar are from those fields. However, we've seen expansion to other fields that conduct applied social science research, such as psychology, marketing, tourism, just to name a few. So, why in the world would we or anyone want to conduct a qualitative systematic review? Well, we do qualitative systematic reviews for the same reasons we do qualitative research in general. We might conduct a qualitative systematic review in order to support or deepen or explain the findings of quantitative research. So in this case, we might conduct a qualitative systematic review in order to explain why an intervention works or doesn't, and for whom and under what circumstances. And doing so might inform the development or scale up of an intervention, for example. Or we might conduct a qualitative systematic review as a project in its own right. Imagine that. In this case, the qualitative systematic review could help us understand how a phenomenon is experienced across multiple accounts captured in multiple studies. And that might yield new insights into the phenomenon, and it might assist in building theory. So let's take the example of a qualitative systematic review conducted by Wayne Au in 2007. So he was interested in the question, what are the effects of high stakes testing on curriculum? So as good qualitative researchers, there are all kinds of ways we might approach this question. We could interview teachers about their perceptions and experiences of high stakes testing. We could conduct a content analysis of syllabi or textbooks. We could spend extensive time in a school doing a field study, observing how curriculum is enacted around testing time, or we could look at how teachers and students talk about high stakes testing. And I'm sure we could spend the rest of this webinar just brainstorming ways that we could find answers to that question. However, it might also be the case that this question has been investigated by other qualitative researchers. And maybe it makes sense to synthesize that literature to understand the effects of high stakes testing across multiple accounts, contexts, investigations using different theories and methodologies. At least this is what Wayne Au thought. So let's say you want to conduct a qualitative systematic review to answer a research question. So now that you have your research question, we can talk about the general process of conducting a systematic review, a qualitative systematic review. So it usually involves developing a protocol, which is like a dissertation or a grant or an IRB proposal. It's your guide for conducting the systematic review. It's your best guess of what you want to do, why you want to do it, and how you're going to do it. It's like sticking a stake in the mud and saying, this is where I'm going. To conduct the systematic review based on that protocol, you search for studies, and then you screen those studies for inclusion. You analyze the included studies, and then of course you write up the findings. So let's just unpack that process. So first we want to decide what studies will be used to answer our review question. So inclusion and exclusion criteria are really important to deciding that. The inclusion and exclusion criteria define the boundaries of your review, the kinds of studies that will and will not count as data. So inclusion and exclusion criteria usually include the time frame. So what years of studies are you looking for? Are you looking for the last 50 years, everything that's been published, or the last 10 years? Conventionally, it's the last 10 years, but of course, this is going to vary depending on your topic and always needs to be justified. You're also going to need to decide what type of publications you want to include in your review. Do you want to only include peer-reviewed journal articles? Do you want to include dissertations, conference proceedings, reports, and so on and so forth? You also want to talk about what kind of methodologies you're going to include. Will you include just qualitative? Will you only include just certain kinds of qualitative studies? Would you include discourse analyses or crazy post-qualitative stuff? It's not crazy, post-qualitative stuff. Another thing that you'll want to think about is the context. So is there a reason to narrow your study based on where it's conducted? You might be interested in just what's happening in the United States, for example, or just in the UK. And then, of course, you narrow based on focus. You decide what topics the people have studied that you want to include and what aspects of those topics you don't want to include. So going back to Au and the study of high stakes testing and curriculum, Au had the following inclusion criteria. So only including original research that used qualitative methods, only original research that used qualitative methods and was conducted in the United States, and only original research that used qualitative methods that was conducted in the United States that addressed the relationship between high stakes testing and either curriculum or instruction or both. Au excluded studies, and there were more exclusion criteria, but these are a couple of examples. One was based on focus. So excluded studies that examined the relationship between high stakes testing and retention, as opposed to curriculum, and excluded studies that focused on student teachers. Apparently there's a lot of literature on pre-service teachers, and Au just said, I'm not interested in that. So after you have developed your inclusion and criteria, and they're all sorted, you can move on to planning and conducting your search. So the point of most qualitative systematic review strategies, although there is some debate on this, is in general to be as expansive as possible. You want to try to create a search strategy that captures every article that could possibly be relevant to your topic. You don't want to leave out an important source of data. So some things to consider. What electronic databases are you going to search? How many? What key terms should you use? Do these key terms differ by the database searched? The answer is yes, they do. How many key terms should be used? And what fields should you search? Do you want to search for the key terms that you use in just the title and the abstract fields, or do you want to search in all the fields? And then how should you use Boolean operators? So these are ors and ands that you use when you create your search strategy to say the and is a way to narrow your search. So in Ao's example, he might be looking for studies, well, he would be looking for studies that studied high stakes testing and curriculum. So he would and the testing keywords and the curriculum keywords. But he might have used or to say, I want to look for studies that call it high stakes testing, but I also want to look for studies that use standardized assessment, for example. So he would put an or between high stakes testing and standardized assessment. And then another thing to think about is what other search strategies are you going to use? So the one that I've been talking about right now is the electronic search strategy, but you might also want to look at the reference lists of all these studies that you included. You might send out an email to all the prominent authors in the field and ask them, hey, have you conducted any research lately that hasn't been published or I haven't run across that should be included? Maybe you search the table of contents of other known journals, for example. Personally, I have found it most helpful to consult university or government librarians, particularly the medical librarians. These folks know databases and database languages like the back of their hands. And every time I write a search strategy, I take it to a librarian and I say, hey, can you help me run this strategy in the different databases that I think are relevant? And invariably, my search strategy changes and they help me see things that I didn't know about the use of that particular database. So these people are really important to good systematic reviews. So here's an example of a search strategy description from Dukes' review of literature on LGBTQ youth with disabilities. So they searched 12 databases. You can see them all listed there in A's, B's, C's, and D's. And then they noted that the databases either did or did not have a controlled vocabulary, which meant the subject terms that they used, those keywords, differed by the databases. And so they had to conduct their searches differently depending on the database. All right. So the next step in a qualitative systematic review is screening all these studies that you've found. So how do you go from a search that yielded this pile of sources, invaluable sources, to this? All right, so get a little bit comfortable. We're going to be on this slide for a little while. It's worth going through. So once you've conducted your search, you begin the inevitable and lengthy process of screening studies for inclusion. The purpose of screening from an initial pool of many, many studies, that giant pile of junk, down to a handful or more, which you can use to create a super cool Canadian car. I really like that picture. Anyway, so this that we're looking at here on this slide is the PRISMA flow diagram from a qualitative systematic review on symptom management for older people with dementia. As a side note, PRISMA stands for, it's an acronym of course, the Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. And this is what most systematic reviewers follow when conducting and particularly writing up their reviews. So let's follow the process communicated in this flow diagram. So the initial search, if you look at the top, yielded 17,871 sources. Don't be surprised. This seems like a lot. For those of you who have conducted systematic reviews before, you're not shocked. Others may be thinking, oh my gosh. This is pretty normal to get 10 to 20,000 initial sources. So what do you do when you have almost 20,000 sources? Well, the first thing you do is you subject them to an abstract screen. So you're just going through the abstracts. So the study team reads, and this is why you need a team, right? This is why systematic reviews usually involve more people than other kinds of reviews. So the study team reads the abstracts and excludes studies that don't meet the inclusion criteria. So this process of abstract screening left this group with a much more manageable 1,102 studies. So from here, the authors pull the full text of all 1,102 studies and screen them again based on those inclusion-exclusion criteria. So it's important at this point to note why studies were excluded at the full text review level. And so you can see here, they said they excluded 643 because they weren't qualitative, 347 were just regular old reviews of literature and were deemed not empirical. Some were excluded based on the focus and others were excluded for some other reason, which I'm sure they explain in their text. So this process of screening all those full text articles brings them to a grand total of 58 papers that reported the results of 56 studies. So at this point, the study team uses an extraction tool to capture important information and analytic notes on each study. In qualitative research, those analytic notes are really important. I mean, it's like your researcher journal or your analytic memos. So the extraction tool captures as much relevant information as possible to make comparing those 58 studies easier. It's also really important for building tables later that are essential to communicating the results of systematic reviews in the write-up. So as part of the extraction process, you might also include an appraisal tool that assesses the quality of each study. And this appraisal tool might assist you in further narrowing the included studies. So that's how the authors got to a sample of 25 final studies that they included in their review. They only included what they referred to as contextually rich papers that in the text they say scored high on reliability and usefulness, which were assessed by their appraisal tool. So speaking of appraisal tools, there are a whole bunch of appraisal tools available for appraising the quality of qualitative studies. And these are most often used if your qualitative systematic review is being conducted alongside or in addition to a quantitative one. Whether to actually use an appraisal tool is a really important decision point for a lot of qualitative systematic reviewers. It raises questions like how do you or even do you judge the quality of qualitative studies? And if you choose to do so, what the heck are you going to do with studies that you deem to be of lower quality? Are you going to exclude them like was done in the previous example? Or are you going to somehow weight their findings to be less than the findings of studies that were deemed to be of higher quality? So if you choose to use an appraisal tool, this right here is a screenshot from the Joanna Briggs Institute website. The Joanna Briggs Institute is Australian-based, and it conducts and supports the conduct of mixed methods systematic reviews in particular. And on this site, you can see they have several qualitative appraisal tools that are available for download, and you can find others by searching on your own. So at this point, you may have realized the importance of having a systematic review or reference manager software. There has to be a place to download all those citations, those 17,781 citations, and screen them. So personally, I've used Reference Manager, which is a reference manager software, for both screening and for just managing the citations. And I've also used a software called Distiller SR, both for citation management and for screening. I typically use Excel for data extraction, but there are other systematic review softwares, including Distiller, that you can use for the entire process. Other software available from the Cochrane and Campbell collaborations. These are systematic review collaboratives that register and support the conduct of health and education systematic reviews, respectively. And the Joanna Briggs Institute that was on the previous slide also has software that supports the conduct of mixed methods systematic reviews. So it's worth doing some research to figure out the software that's going to best support your citation management and screening process. If you have a large team in particular, it's important to have a software that supports multiple users working simultaneously. So that's something to keep in mind. So after the set of studies is narrowed to those that will be included in a review, the fun part begins, the qualitative data analysis. So just like qualitative research in general, there are many ways to approach analysis in qualitative systematic review. Some qualitative systematic review designs suggest particular analyses, and we'll discuss different types of systematic review designs in just a bit. So this is a visual of a thematic analysis of the literature on young people's views of unintended pregnancy. In this review, the authors, if you pull it up, describe their thematic analysis in some detail, and so you can get a sense of how they got to those themes. And thematic analysis is quite a common approach in qualitative systematic reviews. The Wayne Au example, the author of the High Stakes Testing and Curriculum Review, described using template analysis. Template analysis is a three-stage process to develop a coding template and then uses that template to interpret the findings across the set of studies. And so you can see how that would be pretty handy. Just like with the software, it's worth reading several qualitative systematic review write-ups to get a sense of the different available analysis options. Like all qualitative research, qualitative reviewers are going to pick the one that aligns with their designs and is suited to answer their research question, and on a more intuitive level is the process that helps them engage and interpret their studies. And you know that some qualitative researchers really like coding and the security or quote unquote rigor of well-defined steps. And other qualitative researchers are more comfortable with iteration and dialogue and group deliberation processes. So you pick the strategy that works for your design and works for you and your team. So at some point, the qualitative systematic review is going to need to be written up. The writing phase, just as in most qualitative research, may be part of the analytic process. It usually is. So don't be surprised if you continue to amend your themes and theories during the writing process. Tables, to be quite literal, are often a large part of the systematic review write-ups. Tables convey the studies, the methods, the purposes, and other elements of the relevant to your reviews. They're often quite large, and particularly for qualitative systematic reviews, they typically have more text than quantitative reviews. And they may need to be appended or hyperlinked as supplemental material. This is what I've had to do for most of the systematic reviews that I've worked on. Qualitative systematic reviews often follow PRISMA guidelines that detail what elements are important to report, like the search strategy and the screening process and all the other things that we've been through up to this point when describing the systematic review process. The rest of your write-up is going to depend, of course, on the purpose of your review, the type of review you conducted, the journal that you're sending your review to, the extent to which you want to compose a reflexive account, and so on. And just like with most qualitative studies, you're going to want to include excerpts, direct quotes from the studies that you included, and you want to be sure that your write-up doesn't heavily rely on just a handful of studies. So I want to wrap this short webinar by sharing some super cool qualitative systematic review designs and some deliberations, considerations, tensions that all qualitative systematic reviewers face. Qualitative methodologists, who we are so grateful for, have been and continue to be hard at work designing particular brands or types of qualitative systematic reviews. But just like any qualitative research, this doesn't mean you have to choose one of them and adhere to them throughout. You can call your study a qualitative synthesis or a qualitative systematic review and build your own design. You can draw on elements of different qualitative and qualitative systematic review methods and approaches. The main thing, as always, as with any research, is that you need to justify your decisions. So this is just a small set of qualitative systematic review approaches. And you'll see the citation at the bottom. Bartlett, Page, and Thomas have a really great article, even if it is 10 years old, that lays out different types of qualitative systematic reviews. And so this is just a few of them. But there are a few of my favorites. So meta-ethnography, the first one there, is a 7-phase methodology for synthesizing qualitative studies. It's one of the oldest ones. It was developed in 1988 by sociologists in education Noblet and Hare, or Hare, I'm not sure. Meta-ethnography draws on Geertz's concept of thick description and Turner's sociological theory of translation. Meta-ethnography was designed specifically to take into account the unique research context in primary studies. And so that's one of the reasons why it's really helpful to understand why interventions work in some contexts and not others, because of its intensive focus on context. And it also yields new interpretations and new insights, or maybe new theory. The next one, a meta-study, is usually conducted for the purposes of theory building. It was introduced by Patterson and colleagues in 2001 and has 4 distinctive analytic components. So with this one, you're not just analyzing findings, you're analyzing, they call them meta-theory, meta-method, metadata analysis, and then overall synthesis to produce a new theory of a phenomenon. So as the authors describe it, meta-study is used to push the level of theory beyond what is possible in a single study, and emerges with what the authors call a seed of new truth that's produced by taking into account the connections between theory, method, and findings across and within studies. So it takes into account all of those elements as it produces its qualitative review. The next one, critical interpretive synthesis, is an approach to systematic reviewing that was introduced by Dixon and Woods in about 2006. The main purpose of this method is to integrate findings from potentially diverse studies and disciplines into a single coherent framework. Unlike meta-ethnography and meta-study, critical interpretive synthesis includes both qualitative and quantitative studies in its analysis, and it critiques how those studies conceptualize and construct a phenomenon under consideration. And another important distinction between critical interpretive synthesis and other forms of systematic literature review is the rejection of a set of fixed procedural stages in the review process. So instead of describing their methodology in a quote-unquote easy to follow step-by-step process, they describe the process of doing a critical interpretive synthesis as iterative and interactive and dynamic and recursive. And because I have a relatively captive audience, I and 2 colleagues developed what we called a critical construct synthesis. And the purpose of a critical construct synthesis is to critique existing systematic reviews. So as I hope we've seen in this presentation, all systematic reviews draw parameters around what is included and excluded based both on construct decisions, like this study is about people with autism and this study is not about people with autism, and methodology. This study uses qualitative research or is empirical, and this study isn't empirical, doesn't use qualitative research, or doesn't use quote unquote qualitative research. So a critical construct synthesis reveals and critiques the assumptions that are implied in these decisions and explores what could have been known, learned, or understood had the review been conducted differently. So sort of view it as a kind of a gut check on a systematic review. So I want to end the talk with the discussion of some of the dilemmas and tensions within the field of qualitative systematic reviewing. So one of the tensions is around this idea of systematic. What do we mean by systematic? Most qualitative research is iterative and dynamic. Is iterative systematic? So for example, Campbell and colleagues in their evaluation of meta-ethnography said, and I'm quoting here, meta-ethnography has great potential as a method of synthesis in qualitative health research, but it is still evolving and cannot at present be regarded as a standardized approach capable of application in a routinized way. So this makes you pause and say, well, does systematic in a qualitative review mean standardized and routinized? The next area of tension is around the idea of scope. So given qualitative research in general uses purposeful or theoretical sampling, does it make sense to even begin with an exhaustive search? Booth is one writer about systematic reviews who argues a comprehensive search as opposed to an exhaustive search for a qualitative systematic review could very well be sufficient. Another area of tension is around the use of an appraisal tool. And this is probably one of the most contentious areas, or at least one of the areas that has been written about a lot in the literature. How do we evaluate qualitative research? We know that validity in qualitative research varies by paradigm and it varies by design. Is it even possible to use an appraisal tool that's broad enough to compare the quality of, let's say, an autoethnography to a focus group study? Booth, who we talked about above, says probably not, but other folks say no, you can develop an appraisal tool that looks at the basic features of a good qualitative study that you can use across all of them. Another area of tension is around the concept of context. So if qualitative research, or at least most or some qualitative research, is about bringing out the complexities and the richness of situated experience, does it really make sense to synthesize findings across individuals and contexts as represented in studies? Or is the very act of doing a qualitative systematic review a decontextualizing one? That makes you wonder, is this qualitative? And then the final area of tension that I want to talk about is around reflexivity. So if reflexivity is an important component of qualitative research, then how do we qualitative systematic reviewers compose a reflexive account? Some critical appraisal tools include reflexivity of the account. It's like a term, reflexivity of the account, and you can say yes or no or maybe to the extent that an individual study did that. So some appraisal tools have that, but there isn't a lot talked about in terms of the importance of reflexivity in the qualitative systematic review write-up itself. And the extent to which reflexivity is an important part of the process also varies by design. So for example, Dixon and Woods, their critical interpretive synthesis, they say that their critical interpretive synthesis is explicitly reflexive about the author's voice that produces an account of evidence. So in general, individual and available positions on all of these and other issues will always be dependent on the overarching paradigm or philosophy of inquiry that guides the review. And mixed methods in qualitative reviews have been described as having pragmatic or critical realist, constructivist or interpretivist, and certainly post-positivist orientations. And many published qualitative systematic reviews are not explicit about their orientations, and some of them seem to be drawing on the logic of multiple paradigms and orientations. And this is the question that Gordon, the citation here, raises. To what extent is epistemological alignment in the conduct and reporting of qualitative systematic reviews important? So that is the end of my talking at you part of the webinar. Thank you so much for having me. I have included some references and then some resources in these two slides. And again, I'll make them available along with my notes via the IIQM site. And I really look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much. In fact, we do have a set of questions already. What I will do is I will offer the microphone to those people who wrote down their questions. So I would like to ask Sandra if you would like to speak, and I will, if you want to speak, please click on the hand icon next to your name, and that will tell me that I can give you the microphone. Okay, so she hasn't responded, so let me read this out loud for you.
Okay.
Sandra wrote, let me see here, just curious, will you be having a webinar on en vivo? Oh, this is something different.
No,
okay,
I won't.
Sandra. No, Sandra, these are webinars on qualitative methodology and not specifically on software for qualitative data analysis. But you can communicate with en vivo directly for that, as well as with IIQM. Thank you. Let me see what else here. Santosh, would you like to speak? Would you like me to offer you the microphone? Yes, and I will offer you the microphone. Could you start by introducing yourself? Where do you come from? All right, you are unmuted. You have to, let me see here. Click on the microphone icon next to your name. Okay, now it's open. Go ahead. Oh, click on the microphone icon again, please, Santosh. Okay, now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Santosh. I'm a psychiatrist from India. I work at the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences at Bangalore in India. And I've been working in the area of stigma and mental illness for the past 15, 20 years. And predominantly my methods have been qualitative, though there are a few scales which are quantitative in nature as well. So we have had a lot of data using, collecting experiences of people who have had stigmatizing and discriminatory experiences. I just want to know whether we can use other softwares such as Mendeley or EndNote for collecting and organizing data.
Yes, so you're saying data's in the research studies that you might
Yes.
use to conduct a qualitative systematic review on the topic of stigma in
Yes.
mental. Yeah, I believe Mendeley can be used. I certainly know that others have used EndNote. Yeah, so I mean, definitely I encourage you to play around with them and see how they work. The main thing is when you use a reference manager database of any sort, you want to be sure that you have a place where you can create your own fields, or you can augment those fields in order to use them so that each of your exclusion criteria is able to be recorded, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And I had another question following this.
Mm-hmm.
The moment we get to narrowing down, let's say, the example that you showed about 25 articles that
Yep.
were finally chosen in that particular study. So if you want to look at specific aspects of each studies that you would include in your final analysis, I mean, that's quite a lot of number of studies. 25 studies are quite a lot of studies. So the process of further narrowing down your findings would mean the analysis very similar to, let's say, other qualitative methods that we use for, let's say, a particular analysis, where we might have to get down into more and more abstract ways of merging findings and merging having themes that match, and then you come up with more and more abstract themes. So is the analysis very similar to doing analysis for, let's say, a single study where we have multiple themes emerging from several codes, and then you get down into much more abstract, and then you come down to certain themes and you have a thematic analysis. So is it very similar to that?
Yes, most qualitative systematic reviews follow the kind of process that you're describing. I wouldn't say that 25 studies is particularly a lot. I mean, it's not uncommon for qualitative researchers to have 25 interview participants, for example, or to conduct 25 interviews. And so the focus often comes, as you're describing, from getting to those themes, which, yes, I mean, are increasing levels of abstraction.
Okay, so 25 studies can have several themes, and we basically look at those themes and then aggregate the themes, and then further, we kind of narrow them down into further abstract themes. Is that kind of process that we follow?
It's certainly a process that you can follow. Mm-hmm.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you very much, Santosh, and also nice to see you again or hear from you again. And let me now ask you, Santosh, if you could click on the microphone icon next to your name. The next person who has a question is Paula. Paula, would you like to speak? If you would like to speak, click on the hand icon next to your name. Okay, I don't see a response, so I will read out the question. No, in fact, she did raise her hand. So Paula, I will give you now the microphone. Go ahead. You may ask your question. You could start by introducing yourself, please.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm Paula Bush. I'm in Canada. I do a lot of reviews of qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, and I use qualitative, quantitative, and mixed or both syntheses. I was just wondering about NTREC, because you had mentioned you were talking about Prisma, but I was wondering where you see NTREC.
Tell me, because I'm not familiar with NTREC.
Oh, it's the reporting guideline for qualitative syntheses.
Oh, well, tell me about it then and educate the rest of us. I honestly, I haven't followed it. I've typically followed Prisma.
Okay, no, because I usually refer to the Equator Network.
Yep.
For reporting guidelines, and they have a reporting guideline for qualitative synthesis that I'm not well schooled in.
Sure.
But it was just a question that came to mind when you first mentioned you were talking Prisma. I was wondering about NTREC.
NTREC, yeah.
It stands for Enhancing Transparency in Reporting the Synthesis of Qualitative Research.
Qualitative research. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't aware that there was a qualitative research reporting guidelines, and certainly it's good to know. And I would imagine then that would be quite more specific to the kinds of things that we've been talking about with reporting qualitative systematic reviews. I mean, I would be interested to know the extent to which that guideline suggests whether researcher reflexivity, for example,
Yeah.
is important.
I can't remember actually, and I'm trying to find it to pull it up because I cannot remember right now. I don't think it discusses reflexivity, but I cannot remember.
Yeah. And I would assume that there would be other things that would be different. Discussions of validity, for example. And I would be interested to know also if they ask about the research paradigm and whether you should be discussing.
Because I do agree that some of those things that should be discussed. And in fact, when you were talking at the end about the epistemology of each of the included studies, that's not something I have thought of much to date. In fact, because I'm often well, I won't go into the details of that, but that is just something that made me think that okay, what of the epistemologies of each of the studies that are included?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
all. It was just a thought.
no, well, thank you for bringing that up. And if you see my contact information here, I mean, I've written down the acronym, but if you wouldn't mind shooting me
Sure.
an email with that
Sure.
too, that would be grateful. I
Sure.
haven't, I'm wondering, it's interesting because I haven't seen a lot of qualitative systematic reviews referencing that particular format, but maybe I haven't read widely enough.
Well, I just sent to everybody
Uh-huh.
a link to an article on that system. So everybody, if you take a look at the questions section in the GoToWebinar control panel, you will find a link that I sent to all of you, and you can check that. Okay, and I will just send you another one. You know, this is a great thing of this being a webinar, that I can share with you this information very quickly. So let me send, I'm gonna have to send this through chat though. So check everybody under chat, a link that I'm sending you now. Okay, so let me go on to the next person. And this is Martin. Martin, would you like to ask your question out loud? If so, please. Okay, good. I will open your microphone now. You could start by introducing yourself. Okay, go ahead, Martin.
Okay, hello. I'm Martin. I'm actually a master's student at the University of Nebraska. I've actually been using quantitative methods, but currently in the reviews I've been doing, I've also been making use of mixed methods. So my question is in actually synthesizing the discussion from a systematic review, I would like to know what you would think should be a saturation point when you're considering the number of samples you're actually using in order to avoid the limitation of having a small sample size. What would you consider as a sample size that meets the saturation point?
12. I don't know.
Oh.
Yeah, it's that numbers questions in qualitative research are always really, really hard. I mean, certainly people have conducted studies on interview research where they've said, we took 100 interviews or 50 interviews and we coded them and came up with a set of themes, and then we looked at if we just took a subset of those, if we just took 10, would we still come to those same themes? Or if we took 12, would we still come to those same themes, and so on and so forth. And so there have been empirical studies that sort of directly ask this question of can we at least get to thematic saturation, and can we establish a kind of a number for it? I have not heard of that in qualitative systematic reviews. So perhaps that's a study you'd be interested in conducting.
Okay. I also have a question on the methods, the methodology for writing the eligibility criteria, your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Usually for quantitative methods, I've been exposed to the PICO framework. But however, based on your webinar, when you talked about it, is how you analyze and synthesize what you want to do and actually doing what you want to do in your research statement. So for qualitative reviews, can you adapt a PICO framework to do qualitative research? What are the standards?
Yeah, and again, I'm going to say that the word standards is always a bit funny in qualitative research. But certainly you could use adapt, and I have adapted the PICO framework in a qualitative, or at least in a mixed method systematic review. So what is the population and the problem, the intervention, the exposure, the comparison, and the outcome? It just depends on why you're synthesizing the qualitative research. And so if you're doing a mixed methods review, often one of the reasons you're synthesizing the qualitative research is to understand participants' experiences of a particular intervention. And so you might be focusing on, just the elements of the intervention, as opposed to that sort of classic intervention causes outcome framework.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, I would like to ask, I've not necessarily done much on qualitative research methods and systematic review, but I would like to, know the subtle differences between maybe a research that is actually standalone qualitative and standalone quantitative, and also mixed method. Because sometimes I read some papers and they actually use a binary or a categorical data, asking the questions and also quantifying them in the analysis. So I would like to know what is the ideal separation between these various research methods.
You're going to make a big splash in the world. You can get a lot of publications by being quite clear about separations between things. You're absolutely right that you can conduct a qualitative study, a quote unquote purely qualitative study, where you have a qualitative research question and you, for example, conduct interviews and you analyze those interviews, and then you might quantify the themes, right, and the categories, and then subject those to some kind of a descriptive analysis, right? And so already you've sort of blurred a distinction between quantitative and qualitative. And maybe if someone is, quite versed in the field of mixed methods research, they might say, well, no, actually, that's a mixed methods research study. But categories are, they're created by people, and definitions of categories shift and change. And so I cannot provide a satisfactory answer to your question.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you, Jennifer. Because of time, what I will do now is I'm going to read out loud some of the questions. We only have 5 more minutes left. And the next one is from Bridget. Hello, Bridget. Welcome again. She's asking, where do scoping reviews fit in?
Yeah, and that's one that I left out. Scoping reviews are another type of systematic review that just look to give a sense of what literature is out there and what does it look like. Scoping reviews are often conducted as a preliminary step in any kind of a systematic review. And so it's sort of a halfway publication where you haven't quite gotten past, well, you haven't gotten to the part where you're analyzing your data, but you've fully extracted everything. And so you have all this information about all the research that's been published in the field and what kind of methodologies it uses, what sort of topics it studies. And so you can publish a scoping review in and of itself to just give people a sense of what's out there and what's being done. And often a scoping review can reveal the gaps in a particular area. For example, it might reveal that all of the research on this topic has been conducted using correlational designs, and there's never been a qualitative study in this area, or there's never been a randomized controlled trial. Yeah, so that's how I see scoping reviews fitting into all of this.
Thank you. Heather is asking the following. Do you include librarians as co-authors or acknowledge them for their guidance and support for the development of the search strategy?
Oh, what a great question. I've acknowledged in the past, I've acknowledged their support. I've never had a librarian say to me, I would like to be a co-author on this, although if they were interested, I would certainly take them up on that, maybe have them, I don't know, maybe have them do some work on the writing up of the search strategy. That's a great question, though. Maybe they should be.
Thank you. Sandra is asking, and we only have 3 minutes left. Speak to the difference between scoping reviews and a scoping study.
I can't. Can we skip that question?
Yes, of course. The next one, let me see. Jacqueline just wanted to thank you for an informative webinar.
Oh, thanks.
Then Camila is asking, can you explain your method of data extraction using Excel that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way, well, I'm working on a mixed method systematic review right now where we are looking at, yeah, I'm a methodologist, so the topics don't really come to me quickly, but it's on the use of the professional development for multi-tiered systems of support in schools and K-12 education here in the US. So we have an Excel spreadsheet for each study that we are extracting data on. And that Excel spreadsheet has tabs. So each tab reflects a different sort of component of the study that we want to extract. The first tab is study information, the citation, the authors, a broad term for the design. Is it quantitative or qualitative? And then what is the particular design name? So is it a case study? Is it a phenomenology? And so on and so forth. So it's the basic study information. And then the next tab gets more into the content of the study. So what are the quote unquote is the intervention, and what quote unquote is the outcome of the study or the focus of the study. And then what we try to do is we try to cut and paste as much descriptive information about each of those that we can. But of course, when you get into a qualitative study and one of the columns says, please summarize the findings. So in this case, for our qualitative systematic review, we're just putting C chapter 4. And then when the qualitative folk get to the data analysis phase, then they'll of course get more deeply into that. So we have that one, and then we are actually using an appraisal tool. And so that comprises the third tab, where we go through the different elements of the study and we say, yes, maybe, or no to various questions about the methodology. So then we have this Excel spreadsheet for each study, and a fabulous doctoral student, because I don't know Excel well enough to be able to do this, but creates a set of queries that then populates a final sort of mega table across all the studies that has all the studies in different rows and the responses to each of them across the top. And it's that sort of mega table that we're using to construct the tables for our systematic review write-up.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of the presentation, and in fact, we have a very long list of questions, and of course, we cannot answer them all. But Jennifer, would it be okay if people write to you? Your contact information is on the screen now.
Yes, 100%. In fact, I hope you do.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I would like to offer the microphone to Juliana, who is going to, from IIQM, who's going to say a few words closing the session. Juliana? Oh, just a second, Juliana. Just a second, please. There is an issue here with the microphone. Okay, just a minute. Not a minute, a second. Okay, go ahead, Juliana. Go ahead.
Hi, Ricardo. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ricardo and Jennifer, for that wonderful webinar. It's always a pleasure to arrive at these Atlas-sponsored webinars. On the IIQM side, please keep an eye on our website, ualberta.ca. If you search IIQM or International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, you'll come up with a couple of spots. We have next June coming up a blended version of our TQ and QM, Thinking Qualitatively and Qualitative Methodologies conference and workshop series. That's going to be happening June 15th through 19th. And on June 20th, speaking to some of the questions that were coming earlier, we are offering a full day of training, both in atlas.ti and in Vivo software. So that's going to be an exciting addition to that. conference and workshop series. And that registration and site will be up, and registration and abstract submission in early January. So please do keep an eye. And of course, the archive can be found through that UAlberta IIQM site as well. So thank you as always for supporting this ongoing series.
Thank you very much, Juliana. A few words about the archives. There we have webinars since 2013. So you will see a very long list of presentations, some of them by, well, all of them by great researchers. And please make use of this resource. Also talk to your students and tell them to come to the website and also make use of these webinars. And your participation is essential for this series to be successful. We have been going on since 2013, and now we're going to go to our next year. So please keep coming, and we appreciate your participation. And Jennifer, would you like to say a few closing words now?
Just thank you so much for having me. I have been a big fan of the IIQM webinar series for a long time, so it's nice to be a contributor to it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. And you will be receiving this the recording of this presentation about 3 hours from now. Thank you, all of you. Goodbye.